So today we're introducing the concept of emotion. So emotion is comprised of our physical and our mental arousal, and how this connects to another part of our unit, which is motivation, is that our motivated behaviors, or our behaviors in general, are often driven by very powerful emotions. So think of motivation as kind of how that arousal and how that emotion turns into action. So, emotion is really a four-part process that involves physiological arousal. So, it involves a physical response, increased heart rate, increased respiration, slowing of digestion. So, think about that sympathetic nervous system response. A component of all emotions is this physiological arousal. It's also made up of a cognitive interpretation. So that means we are weighing, we are assessing the situation that we're in, and we're deciding how we feel. Our subjective feelings, or, as our brain senses this arousal, we might experience memories of past situations. And these memories are going to be retrieved. And so, along with the physiological arousal and the cognitive interpretation, we have feelings involved as well, which are very specific to us. They're subjective. And finally, emotions can produce behavior. They can produce some kind of behavioral expression. Okay, so these emotions act as motives because they're going to help organize and direct our behavior. If I was in a scary situation where maybe I felt like someone was following me, right? My heart would start to race. I would start thinking about my surroundings, and I would start to decide, if I was um, maybe in a dark alley with no one else around, it would be different than if I was out in the middle of the street with a lot of people there, right? I would start to maybe think of past situations, maybe films I've seen, scary movies, or someone ends up in a bad situation where somebody's following them, and that might then direct my behavior. I would then start thinking about, well, what do I do next? Do I run? Do I try to find another person? Do I call for help? So these are all different components of what an emotion is. So, questions that researchers have been trying to answer for over 100 years now are kind of, what is this mind body connection? The two main questions are, number one, does arousal come before or after the emotional feelings? And number two, how do thinking and feeling interact? Does thinking come before emotion, or do I react emotionally, then interpret the situation that I'm in? So, we're going to talk about some different theories of emotion, the historical theories of emotion. The first of which is the James Longa theory, that says an emotion provoking stimulus is going to create a physical response or an arousal that in turn produces our emotion. So, for example, I see a shark, my muscles tense, I feel afraid. In this case, I feel afraid because of the awareness of my physiological response. Support for this historical theory might be, like, how do you feel after you've had coffee, right? Coffee is a stimulant, caffeine's a stimulant, I should say. And that might already kind of amp you up and prepare you, because you're already aroused, to maybe experience emotions in a stronger way. I know for me, when I drink coffee that's too strong, I'm much more likely to like overreact and get very upset. But this theory is problematic because it leaves out the cognition part. It leaves out the thinking that we know is an important component of emotion. Our next historical theory is the Cannon-Bard theory, which says that the emotion itself and the physiological response occur at the same time. One is not the cause of the other, like in James Longa theory. However, there's research showing now that in people with spinal cord injuries, uh, people with injuries to the lower part of the spine report experiencing no change in the intensity of emotions, whereas people with upper spinal cord injuries do report changes in emotional intensity. And this means that, to an extent, our emotions must be a product of that physiological arousal. So, in other words, the feelings that we have, researchers think, are kind of shadows of our bodily responses. Okay, because when an individual is paralyzed and they're unable to experience that same physiological bodily response, it changes the extent to which they're able to feel the emotion. So, Cannon-Bard theory, again, research kind of points to this notion that we're probably not experiencing the emotion and the physiological response at the same time. our feelings are likely a product of that physiological response to a large extent. And then we have Schachter-Singer theory, or the two-factor theory, which for the first time is taking into account our thinking, our cognitive appraisal or interpretation of the situation that we're in. So according to Schachter-Singer theory, emotions have two ingredients: physiological arousal and cognitive appraisal, which again is our interpreting the situation that we're in and labeling an emotion. So I see a shark, my heart pounds, I decide I'm afraid, I'm afraid. The I decide is what makes this theory different from the others that we talked about. The cognitive label is what makes it different. So if I see a shark at the aquarium in a tank, I'm going to interpret that stimulus. I'm going to interpret the situation and appraise the situation and decide that I'm not afraid. I'm not going to label my emotion as fear. Whereas if I were to see that same shark out in the ocean, I'm going to experience that physical arousal, and that cognitive appraisal is going to go, oh my gosh, I'm out in the wild with this shark, and obviously it's not the same as being in an aquarium, and it's going to lead to a much different labeling of an emotion. In that case, you're obviously going to fearful. So what this theory again is taking into account is this notion of appraisal or interpretation of a stimulus. And we see also with Schachter-Singer theory what is called the spillover effect. There's research where men were injected with epinephrine, which we know from learning about the stress response is going to cause that physiological arousal, going to cause the heart to race, the breathing to quicken and everything, right? And then these individuals are put into a room with someone who's acting very euphoric or very irritated. Now, those people are actually actors and they're in cahoots with the experimenter. But what matters here is whether or not the individuals are told about the drug. One group is told that the effects of the drug are that physiological arousal, and those individuals will attribute their arousal to the drug. They won't they won't attribute their increased heart rate and respiration and perspiration with the person who's acting in the room, either euphoric or irritated. Whereas the individuals who are not told about the drug, or they're told and they know that they've been injected, but they don't know that the effects of the drug are that physical arousal, they instead find themselves getting either very happy or very annoyed at the person who's in the room with them because they're attributing their arousal to the person. They don't know that this is a particular side effect of the drug itself. So, it helps explain why there are situations where, like, I think the example in your textbook is if you go out for a run and then you come home and you get, like, a letter of acceptance from a college, you might be more apt to have, like, a greater emotional response because you're already aroused from the run than if you had just stayed up all night studying and you go to check the mail and you're exhausted and there is the letter. So that's an example of the spillover effect, and also an example of how, there is a level of cognition and interpretation involved in our experience of emotion. That brings us to our final theory, which is cognitive appraisal theory, that essentially says that there are two different routes to emotion. If you recall that high road and low road that we talked about when we studied the consciousness, we know there's this high road, which is made up of the cerebral cortex, which is where all of our higher level thinking occurs. And the low road is comprised of parts of the brain like the amygdala, for example. So what this theory essentially says is that complex emotions like hatred and love are a product of the high road, whereas our simple likes and dislikes are very quick, automatic fear responses when we're in a scary situation are products of this low road. And we know that the amygdala sends more information, more neural messages up to the cortex than it receives back, which is why oftentimes our feelings are able to override our cognition, or we might, our thoughts might be clouded by the emotion. We may not think clearly and act rationally when we're very emotionally aroused. But what's happening here essentially is that Zajonc and Ledoux emphasize this notion that some of our emotions are immediate and they occur without any kind of conscious appraisal. So there's an event, an emotional response. I see that shark out in the ocean. I immediately feel fear because the amygdala senses the threat, and before the high road can even get involved and I can even think about it, my body has already started to mobilize and I already feel fearful. Whereas Richard Lazarus and Dr. Singer theory emphasizes that there are also some emotions that involve the high road and this process of appraisal. And there are even some situations where the low road might kick in immediately. So, in other words, I'm walking through the woods and I hear a noise, right? Immediately, low road response, the amygdala has me scared. I realize, okay, it's just an owl in the tree up above me. It's nothing to be frightened about. Well, now that's the high road kicking in next, helping me to rationalize so that I'm no longer feeling fearful. So it's just this notion that we have some emotional responses that operate on this very fast automatic low road and others that do involve conscious cognitive appraisal. So it's kind of, I guess, marrying some of the theories that we've learned about so far together. And it's emphasizing this idea that emotions are a product of both, kind of like an automatic physiological response as well as our conscious thinking.